everyone, Karen the Warp Spinster here. Thank you for joining me on this gloomy day. It's especially good to have my good and kind viewers watching while I am working on a cloudy day. Maybe snow, maybe rain later, we don't know, but something's going to happen. Anyway, last week we worked on this piece using 2.5-inch squares, and I love this piece. So this is going to become a quilt at some point. And I shared some photos in last week's video of what I might do with it. And I'm tending toward the one that looks kind of like a circuit board. Anyway, I am going to continue with 2.5-inch squares today because I have all kinds of resources to do 2.5-inch squares. I had two choices for making 2.5-inch squares in something that isn't my usual fabric. I try to do some explorations with different kinds of fabrics. I usually use bright solids. Some people love prints, so I try to do some with prints. These pastels are really not my usual thing, but I made a baby quilt for a miracle baby with these, and it's currently on the long arm. In the process of being quilted. As long as I have enough strips here to bind the quilt, I can use whatever I want of this. I also have this roll of 2.5-inch ombre fabrics from Marcus. And again, these aren't really, they're really too pastel for what I usually do, but I think I'm going to hang on to it because it's a complete, I guess I'm hoarding it basically, because it is a complete roll of 2.5 inches. So I'm sure some perfect project will show up in a year now. So I'm going to start with this and do some 2.5-inch squares from this because I'm probably not going to use these for any other quilts, just as they are. So I'm going to cut some 2.5-inch squares, and I'll show you what the project is. It's kind of similar, I think, to something I did quite a long time ago with 2.5-inch squares, but it's a little different, sort of a combination of what we did. I guess it was 2 weeks ago, not last week. Sort of what we did then, and it's a combination of the two from a long time ago, or just a couple of weeks ago. This does not bode well for the rest of this, does it? If I can't find my words in the introduction. So I'm going to do some 2.5-inch strips from various strips here, and we'll come back. I'll also take out some white, of course. I have a new bolt, 20-yard bolt of white, so I'm ready to go, although I'm going to be using scraps mostly for this. So I will see you in a bit when I have some squares. My plan is to start out by sewing, actually I want a couple of strips that I sew together, a couple of strips that I make from sewing things together. I'll get it out, I promise. And what do we want to put at the top of that one? Let's do a darker blue up here. Now, one of these is going to stay as this strip. One of them is going to be sewed into a strip and then cut in half and shifted a bit. And then there'll be white in between. I am going to proceed to sew these together. This time I will dig out some white and I will take it from there. I have pulled out some white scrap strips of various widths. You may not be able to see it on camera, but these are slightly different whites. For white, almost always buy a Bella white. There's a white bleached and a bleached white. And I know in the past I have gotten bleached white, and now I buy white bleached. So I have that combination here. It's very subtle. Sometimes I think it's more obvious in a quilt, but I don't mind it. I want to use scraps, and as long as it's mixed around the quilt, it isn't going to matter. So I am ready to cut this then. This is 2.5 inches wide, so to cut it in half, let me think. Wouldn't actually have to be in half, but we're going to start off with it in half. So I'm going to slice that. And then I'm going to shift this over on the sides. Now, I've got all kinds of choices for shifting, of course. I could shift one up and one down. That's just a little too symmetrical for me. This is kind of symmetrical, but not really. I could shift them different distances. I could flip them around. But I think I kind of want that effect of knowing that this one has, visually anyway, split this strip. So then I'll have white strips in between, just for illustration's sake here, and then I will have strips to fill out down here and up there. Then I will also have strips off to the side, and those I'll probably use the wider strips because I want this to end up square, because the pieces that I'm going, the next block that I'm going to do is going to be sort of turned. So these would alternate, I think, on the quilt. So I want the width of this to be the same as the length of the next piece and vice versa. So square, basically. So I'm going to add some white onto the edge and then cut it, trim it on there with those strips in order to make it square. Now, I don't think that I'm going to be using a consistent width of strip here from block to block. I may within the block, or I may not. See, so many choices when you start thinking about these things. I think not. All right, so I'm going to be adding strips on to the side so that I can do every block square, make every block square. And I could figure out how to do it without strips here by figuring what the length of this is going to be and making these strips. No, I don't want to do that. So I'm going to have wide strips here and just trim it to square based on that. Now, I could also arrange it so that I have some white down here as well and some white up here. But I don't think on this first one I'm going to do that. I'm going to just have it shifted up and then fill in one at top and two at the bottom, then fill out the sides. The next block is going to have a lot of white in it, so I don't anticipate that these are ever going to run into another color and sort of muddy the waters here. That was a long way of saying, let me show you what I'm going to do here. So the first thing I will do is decide how much of a shift I want in here. And I do want it to be fairly appreciable. And why don't I just go with the length of strips that I have here? Why not? And I do want them to be different widths, so I'm going to trim this one down. Then I'm going to have to add some white here and up here. I will do all of that and come back, and then we'll talk more about doing the white strips on the side. Because I think that my words were not used very well talking about the fillers, just going to show you I added a filler up at the top here and some at the bottom. I just haven't trimmed that yet. And also added these intervening strips. So those will get sewed together, and then I'll trim the bottom. Then I'll add on the white side strips, and I guess I will know actually how long or wide they need to be, because this is, whew, can you believe it? It is 11 inches, and That means that once I put these together, I can measure those, see how wide it is, and then give me an idea of how wide each of these needs to be. And again, do I want those to be the same width? Don't have to be. They don't have to be. Now, I'm just thinking, because my scraps are really not long enough, quite long enough for these wide bits, what would happen if I just did a really narrow little slice of a contrasting color here? And then that would give me a chance to add on, to piece it basically, but have a little design extra in there. So I think I'll do that. Just have to decide what colors and where, but I think that could be kind of cool. Plus I can use my strips without breaking out, you know, with the fabric kind of strips. So just trying to use my scraps here. We'll see what happens. Wish me luck. I decided to do a neutral splicing here, and because these are soft colors, I decided on a reasonably soft gray, not black and white stripes. And there are no circles that I have figured into this just yet. Anyway, because I wanted this to be pretty narrow, I stitched a 1/4 of an inch seam, and then I trimmed it to 1/8 of an inch before I stitched my next 1/4 inch seam on the other side, so that when I pressed them toward each other, they wouldn't be creating bulk there. So this is going to kind of encase that when I press it there. And I am pressing all of this away from the white. First, because I don't want it to bleed through the white. This is a fairly thin fabric. But also because doing that sort of lifts the color pieces off of the fabric, and that's what I want. It gives them a little accent and then puts this white more in the background. So now I have a strip long enough. I just have to decide where I want that piece to be. And I think I might want it, maybe, sorry about my elbow there. And I have kind of a, yeah, you maybe saw my ratty cuff on my sweatshirt. The cuff is the only ratty part of it, and this is such a comfy sweatshirt, so I'm trying to keep my ratty cuff out of frame. Sorry if it slipped in there. I think that I want this to be maybe down here. Accents this very light pink a little bit. All right. Now I need this to be 11 inches wide in the end, and the center part is about 5 1/4. So I'm going to add another white strip over here. I'm thinking about whether I want to splice a gray in there or leave it plain. I think I will splice a gray, but it will be in another place. And I will also decide how wide I want each side once I get both sides put on. If I want it to be kind of, if I want it to be symmetrical at the same width on both sides, or if I want it to be different widths. So next step, get this next bit ready to sew on. And then of course I will trim it all. Here is our block in its almost finished state. We need to trim this. Once I've trimmed this, I'm going to double check my length, and it's actually 10 7/8. And we have well over 12 here. I really like this gray strip. It adds a more structural kind of quality to it. Plus it is another design element to sort of tie everything together. Well, that does not look like a straight cut up there, but I swear I did do a straight cut. I'll trim it again just to be sure, a tiny bit. All right, so I'm going to start off, I think, by just trimming this side, which I think is not cut very evenly. the time the scraps were done. And let's say we want that to be the widest part. Then that puts this next one at about here, which makes them about equal. I'm not sure I want that, so I'm going to trim a little more off here. And I'm trying to line up along this strip of color and also with the gray strip, trying to keep things reasonably square. And now I have to do 10 7/8, which would be there. I think that will be all right. Should have my 10 7/8 here. Now, there are probably better ways I could have done that, but this works. Now I have a strip that I might use somewhere. A cute little strip. I will save that. And now we have our square, which doesn't look very square. Need to do a little more pressing, I guess, but I rather like it. Now, what I have planned, and we'll do it next week, but what I have planned is to do another block, but make it much more white. So I'll have maybe 2 squares in a strip, and then shift a little bit, but still have the same size square, the same 10 7/8 inch. It's just going to have a whole lot of white in it, which I think will have kind of a dot effect. So we'll have this stripe and then kind of a dot here. And it's going to be turned. So it will be like this, but it will be much less in the, with these colored blocks in it. So we'll see how that goes. And we'll do that next week. Isn't going to be a really whiz-bang thing. But then also next week, I'll put these together, put it in Procreate, and kind of play around with it and see how it looks in different organization, different layouts. So I think that is it for this week. You know what? I'm just noticing I didn't really get these lined up. Honestly, I wasn't paying attention when I sewed those on. I was just going by the top. So there's a lesson learned there. And this is, it's just the way it's going to be since I want it pressed toward this gray strip. But I'm glad I added the gray strips. I think it's a little, adds a little something to it. You know I'm going to have to try a circle. You just know I'm going to have to. So I'm going to cut one and I'll be right back. It's probably not going to work, but I have to do it. I know what you're going to say, Karen, get a grip. You don't have to put circles on everything. And you're right, of course, but I don't hate it. It adds a little something, right? I don't like that as much, but I think it could be something to play with when we get further along. But yeah, I know, I'm getting a grip now. But hey, let me know what you think. Is there anybody else out there who likes to have circles dropped in on this? Let me know. All right, that's it for this week. Next week we will work on the alternating block, see how that comes out. May or may not do more circles. I don't know. I hope to see you next week. In the meantime, be well, be safe, be happy, be quilting. Peace out.